The dust had not yet settled on the main road into Caldwell, Kansas, when David Doyle looked up from the fence post he was mending and felt the bottom of his world drop clean out from under him. It was the summer of 1882, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a man's brow, always on the verge of dripping somewhere it did not belong. The town had grown some in the past few years, filled out with a general store, a proper church, a land office, and two saloons that competed more fiercely than any two churches ever had. The cattle drive still moved through, though the railroad had changed things considerably, and men like David Doyle had traded the saddle for the fence line, choosing to put down roots rather than keep chasing the horizon. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled at the ears when it grew too long. He had a jaw like the edge of a bluff and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale blue and quiet. Most days he spoke only when something needed to be said, and most days he found that very little needed saying. He owned 43 acres northeast of Caldwell, a modest herd of cattle that numbered just under 100 head, and a house that was 2 rooms too small for comfort but 4 rooms better than the bunkhouse where he had spent the better part of his 20s. He had a dog named Cooper who slept under the porch, and a horse named Roan who did not trust strangers. He had a neighbor named Earl Pickens who borrowed things and forgot to return them, and a hired hand named Tobias who was 17 and still growing into his hands. He had, by most measures, a life. A quiet one, a solitary one, but a life all the same. What David Doyle did not have, and had not had in 11 years, was any reason to think about Clara Ralston. He thought about her anyway, on certain nights when the wind came down from the north and the stars were too bright to ignore. He thought about her dark hair and her wide brown eyes, and the way she had laughed at things other people did not think were funny. He thought about the 2 years they had spent together in Abilene before everything went sideways, before pride and stubbornness, and a disagreement that had seemed enormous at the time, had driven a wedge between them that neither had been willing to pull out. He thought about the morning he had ridden south and she had not come to the door to watch him go, and he thought about how he had told himself that was for the best. He had never entirely believed it. But 11 years was a long time, and a man learned to live inside the shape of his regrets the same way a river learned to live inside its banks. The water still moved. It just moved in the direction it was given. On this particular July afternoon, David was mending the eastern fence line because 3 of his cattle had pushed through it the previous evening and wandered onto Earl Pickens's property, where Earl had very nearly shot one of them before David arrived to collect them. He was sweating through his shirt and arguing quietly with a stubborn post when he heard the sound of a horse on the road. That was not unusual. The road into Caldwell saw plenty of traffic, especially this time of year. He did not look up immediately. Then Roan, tied to the fence 30 feet away, lifted his head and pricked his ears forward in the way he did when something interested him, and Roan did not interest easily. David straightened, squinting against the afternoon glare. There was a rider on the road, a young woman, sitting a chestnut mare with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up in the saddle. She was dressed practically in a divided riding skirt of dark brown canvas and a white blouse that had seen considerable travel. Her hat was pulled low against the sun, which meant David could not make out her face from this distance. But there was something in the way she held herself, something in the line of her shoulders and the particular tilt of her chin, that struck him with the force of a thrown stone. The rider slowed. She was looking at the fence line, at the house visible in the middle distance, at the hand-lettered sign David had nailed to the gate post 3 springs ago that read Doyle, ranch, in letters that were reasonably straight if you did not examine them too critically. She looked at all of this the way someone looks at something they have been trying to locate for a considerable length of time. Then she turned her horse off the road and came through the gate, and when she was close enough that David could see her face clearly, he stopped breathing. She had Belle's eyes. Exactly Belle's eyes, that precise shade of warm brown with the darker ring around the iris. She had the same strong cheekbones, the same dark hair, the same way of pressing her lips together when she was deciding something. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts determination and something he could not quite name. "Are you David Doyle?" she asked. Her voice was steady, steadier than his would have been had he been able to produce any words at all. "I am," he managed. "My name is Clara," she said. "Clara Ralston." She paused, and the pause held the weight of something enormous. "My mother was Belle Ralston. I believe you knew her." The hammer fell out of David's hand. He did not notice it fall. He was too busy staring at this young woman on her chestnut mare, with her mother's eyes and her mother's cheekbones, and her mother's way of lifting her chin when she was bracing herself to say something difficult. "Was," he repeated. The word landed wrong. "You said was." Clara Ralston looked at him steadily, and he could see that whatever steadiness she was projecting was costing her something. "My mother passed in February," she said. "Influenza. She was ill for nearly 3 weeks before she passed." The afternoon seemed to tilt around David, the way the world tilts when you step off a wagon and the ground is further down than you expected. He put a hand on the fence post to steady himself. Belle Ralston was dead. Belle, who had laughed at things other people did not think were funny. Belle, who had ridden a horse like she was born to it, who had made the best coffee he had ever tasted in his life, who had argued with him about everything and been right about most of it. Belle was gone. "I am sorry to hear that," he said, and the words were completely inadequate and he knew it. "There is something else I need to tell you," Clara said. She was gripping her reins with careful precision. "My mother told me in her final days that my father was a man named David Doyle. That he had been a rancher in the Kansas Territory or had been heading that direction when she knew him. She said I had his eyes." A faint, complicated expression crossed her face. "I always thought I had my mother's eyes, but she was fairly specific about the color." David stared at her. He did the arithmetic, the way a man does when numbers have never mattered more in his life. 11 years since he had left Abilene. 11 years since he and Belle had parted. Clara looked to be about 18 or 19. The numbers did what numbers do, which is to say they told the truth regardless of whether anyone was prepared to hear it. "Your mother never wrote," he said. He was not saying it to defend himself. He was saying it because he needed to understand the shape of what had happened. "She was proud," Clara said simply, "and I think she was angry for a long time." Another pause. "She did not tell me who my father was until she was dying. She made me promise to find you." "She made you promise to find me," David repeated. "She said you were a good man," Clara said. "She said that whatever had happened between you had nothing to do with your character. She said I deserved to know where I came from." She looked at him directly, unflinching. "So I found you." David Doyle had lived through a cattle stampede in the summer of 1871, had been caught in a blizzard in the winter of 1874, had been robbed at gunpoint twice, and had the presence of mind to remain calm both times. He had believed himself to be a man not easily undone by the unexpected. He understood now that he had been wrong about that. "Will you come inside?" he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say. "It is hot, and you have clearly ridden a distance." Clara looked at him for a moment as if measuring something. Then she swung down from the saddle with practiced ease, exactly the way her mother had always dismounted, and said, "All right." They sat at David's kitchen table, which was covered in a map he had been consulting about a potential land purchase, and 2 coffee cups that had been sitting there since morning. He cleared away the map and poured water from the pitcher, and then, after a moment's consideration, put the coffee on, because it seemed like a situation that called for coffee. Clara sat across from him with her hat in her lap and looked around the kitchen with those eyes that were not her mother's eyes but were also precisely her mother's eyes. "How did you get here?" he asked. "Where were you living before?" "Ellsworth," she said. "We had a small house there. I worked at the milliner's shop. When my mother passed, I used what she had saved to buy the mare and enough provisions to make the journey. She glanced at the window at the late afternoon light. It took me 11 days. You rode here alone. I did. David absorbed this information. An 18-year-old girl alone on the Kansas plains for 11 days looking for a man she had never met. The courage of it, or the desperation of it, or the particular combination of the two that the situation seemed to require. That was not safe, he said. Clara's expression did not change much, but something in it shifted toward amusement. My mother was a practical woman. She taught me to shoot when I was 12. She paused. I also have a good instinct for which men to avoid. There was something so precisely like Belle in that statement that David had to look away for a moment, toward the window and the yard and the normal afternoon world that was continuing to exist outside while his particular corner of it had been entirely rearranged. "Tell me about her," he said. "Tell me about the last 11 years." And so Clara told him. She told him about the small house in Ellsworth, about the school she had attended through the age of 16, about the milliner's shop and the woman who ran it, a Mrs. Pendleton who was strict and fair in equal measure. She told him about her mother's friends, a handful of women who had formed the kind of fierce, practical alliance that women in frontier towns learned to build. She told him about her mother's garden, which had produced more tomatoes than two people could ever reasonably consume, and about the cat they had kept whose name changed yearly, because Belle could never settle on one she liked well enough to commit to. She told him hesitantly about the men who had come and gone from Belle's life over the years, none of them staying, none of them amounting to anything permanent, and David listened to this without any expression at all on his face, though something in his chest moved in a way that was not entirely comfortable. "She kept a photograph," Clara said eventually. She reached into the breast pocket of her riding coat and produced something small, slightly bent at one corner. She set it on the table between them. It was a tintype, the kind that had been common in Abilene in the late 1860s and early 1870s. David and Belle, standing together outside a photographer's studio, he remembered very clearly, because Belle had argued with the photographer about the positioning of the light and had been correct about that as well. They were not touching in the photograph, because Belle had thought public displays of affection were undignified, but they were standing close enough that their shoulders nearly met, and anyone looking at the image could see plainly that these two people were bound together by something. David looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at his younger self, 23 and lean, and wearing a shirt that Belle had picked out because she had said the one he owned was embarrassing. He looked at Belle, her dark hair pinned up, her chin lifted at that particular angle. "She kept this," he said. "She kept it in her Bible," Clara said. "She did not speak of you, but she kept it." David set the photograph down carefully. Outside, Cooper started barking at something, probably a rabbit, and the ordinary afternoon sounds of his ranch continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened in his kitchen. Roan would need water. The fence post he had been mending was still lying on the ground with the hammer beside it. Tobias would be back from town by supper time expecting to be fed. "You can stay," David said. "I have a second room. It is not much, but it is a room with a door and a real bed, which I imagine is a considerable improvement over 11 days on the trail." Clara looked at him. He could see her deciding how much to trust this. He understood that she had come here with a purpose and had accomplished it, and that what came next was less clear for both of them. "I do not want to impose," she said. "You are not imposing," David said. "You are my daughter." He said it out loud for the first time, and the words sat on the air between them, large and unfamiliar and somehow exactly right. "I think that changes the nature of the arrangement." Something shifted in Clara's expression. The steadiness she had been maintaining with such careful effort developed a hairline crack, and behind it he could see the girl who had ridden 11 days across the Kansas plains to find a father she had never met, who had buried her mother 6 months ago and had been making do alone ever since. "All right," she said. "Thank you." David nodded, and they sat together in the kitchen while the coffee grew strong, and the afternoon light moved across the floor, and two complete strangers tried to find the beginning of something neither of them had a map for. In the days that followed, Clara Ralston became a presence on the Doyle ranch with the kind of efficiency that suggested she had always been practical in a crisis, which David suspected she had inherited from her mother. She helped Tobias with the morning feeding without being asked, and turned out to be better at reading the cattle for signs of illness than anyone David had employed in 10 years. She could cook, adequately if not brilliantly, and she was not afraid of hard work. She also had opinions, which she expressed without particular apology, and which were, as had been true of her mother's opinions, more often correct than not. She had been on the ranch for 4 days when she said, over supper, "You should go to the dance." David looked up from his plate. "What dance?" "The one Mrs. Calloway is organizing at the Grange Hall on Saturday," Clara said. She had been in town that afternoon for supplies and had apparently absorbed a considerable amount of local intelligence in the process. "Tobias told me about it. He says you have not attended a social event in at least 2 years. "Tobias talks too much," David said. "He talks an appropriate amount for someone who is starved for conversation," Clara said. "You are not an easy man to speak to." David considered being offended by this and decided she was right. "I'm not much for dances." "That is a shame," Clara said, with the particular tone of someone who has already decided to keep pressing. "Because I would like to go, and I do not know anyone in Caldwell yet, and it would be considerably less awkward if I attended with you rather than alone." David looked at his daughter, with her mother's eyes and her mother's particular talent for making a request sound like the only reasonable possible course of action. He sighed in the way that a man sighs when he knows he has already lost the argument. "All right," he said, "we will go to the dance." The Grange Hall on Saturday evening was lit with lanterns along both walls and smelled of sawdust, and the particular combination of perfume and wood smoke that David associated with every social gathering he had ever attended in Kansas. The fiddle player was a man named Peters who had 3 fingers on his left hand, and played better than anyone with a full complement, and the caller was the town barber, who had a voice like a freight train and the energy to match. Clara had found, somewhere, a blue dress that David suspected had been purchased in Ellsworth and packed with this precise occasion in mind. She walked into the Grange Hall and immediately drew attention the way her mother had always drawn attention, not by trying, but simply by being there with that particular quality of self-possession that made a room rearrange itself slightly around her. David stayed near the edge of the room and watched his daughter navigate introductions with a grace he had not expected and a warmth that was entirely her own, different from Belle's more guarded manner, and felt something in his chest that was complicated and quiet and fierce all at once. He was getting a cup of punch he did not particularly want when the woman appeared at his elbow. He had not seen her immediately because she had been on the far side of the hall talking with a group of women near the windows, and also because his attention had been focused on Clara. But now, she was standing 3 feet away refilling her own cup, and he recognized her the way you recognize something that has been in your peripheral vision for so long that seeing it directly feels like the most natural thing in the world. She was 32, or thereabouts. Dark hair pulled back in a practical arrangement that had partially escaped its pins in the way that hair at a dance always eventually did. She was wearing a green dress that was not new but had been cared for well. She was not trying to draw attention, and she was drawing it anyway, at least from David, who had apparently not learned anything from the last 11 years about where looking at certain kinds of women was likely to lead him. She looked over and caught him staring, and instead of looking away she tilted her head slightly and said, "You are the man who bought the Garrison acreage a few years back." "That is right," David said. "David Doyle." "Margaret Holt," she said, and shook his hand in the direct, unself-conscious way of a woman who had never had the luxury of being indirect. "I have the farm south of the river. My late husband bought it in 1875. "I know the place," David said. "The one with the big oak along the fence." "That is the one." She sipped her punch. "The young woman who came in with you, she resembles you around the eyes." David found this startling since he had been thinking all week that Clara resembled no one but her mother. "Does she?" "Something in the expression," Margaret said. "The way she watches a room before she decides to enter it." She glanced at him. "I do the same thing. My daughter calls it suspicious. I prefer cautious." "You have a daughter, Lucy." "She is 12. A brief, warm shadow crossed Margaret's face. "Her father passed 2 years ago, fever." "I am sorry. Thank you." She said it simply, without the apologetic deflection that people sometimes offered when their grief was acknowledged. "It has been a hard few years, but we manage." They stood together for a moment, side by side, watching the dancers. Clara had been asked to dance by a young man who had the look of someone who had been rehearsing this particular request for at least 20 minutes, and she was dancing with him in a way that was polite and slightly amused. "She just arrived this week," David said. He was not entirely sure why he was telling a stranger this, but something about Margaret Holt made it seem like the sort of thing that could be said. "I did not know she existed until she rode up the road." Margaret looked at him. She did not say anything for a moment. "That is a considerable thing to take in," she said finally. "Yes. And you are managing." "I believe so." He paused. "I am doing the same thing she is doing, probably, deciding as I go." Margaret nodded. She had a way of listening that was entirely attentive without being intrusive, the way a person listens when they have learned that the space inside a conversation is sometimes more important than what fills it. David found this quality remarkable because it was the rarest kind. "Will you dance?" he asked, which surprised him somewhat because he had come to this dance with every intention of standing at the edge of it. Margaret looked at him for a moment, with the slightly cautious assessment of someone who has learned to be careful about where they put their trust. Then she said, "I will." They danced to a reel and a waltz and half of a polka before David stepped on her foot with enough enthusiasm to end the polka early. Margaret laughed, and the laugh was low and genuine and entirely unguarded, and David thought that it was a very good laugh and that he would like to hear it again. Afterward they sat on the bench outside the hall in the warm summer night while the music continued inside, and they talked in the way that people sometimes talk when they have been given more of each other's company than expected and have discovered they do not mind. She told him about the farm, about the challenges of running it alone with a 12-year-old and 2 hired men who were reliable but not inspired. He told her about his cattle and his fence, and the ongoing feud with Earl Pickens about borrowed equipment. She told him about her husband, Robert Holt, who had been a good man and a fair farmer and who had died of typhoid at 38, and she told it plainly, with the particular combination of grief and acceptance that time eventually negotiates between. He told her about Belle, because the evening and the conversation seemed to call for honesty, and also because Clara was inside the hall and it felt important that the truth be somewhere in the air around this. He told her about Abilene and the 2 years and the argument and the 11 years of not quite forgetting. Margaret listened to all of it. "She loved you," she said when he was done. "Women do not keep photographs in their Bibles of men who did not matter to them." "I know," David said. "I think I always knew." "And you?" He considered the question. "I loved her. I was also 23 and afraid of the shape of things, and I chose pride over sense." He was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about that more than once." "Most people worth knowing have made at least one version of that choice," Margaret said. She was looking at the sky, which was the particular deep blue of a Kansas summer night with the Milky Way spread across it like a pale road going somewhere worth following. "The question is what you do with the time that comes after." David looked at her profile against the night sky and thought that this was an extremely good observation, and that Margaret Holt was a woman who had earned her observations the hard way, which was the only way they were ever really worth having. They went back inside when Clara found them on the bench and looked at the two of them with an expression that was so precisely like Belle's knowing expression that David felt the echo of it somewhere in his sternum. Clara said nothing about what she may have observed, but she was quiet on the ride home in a way that felt thoughtful rather than unhappy. In his bed that night, with the summer air coming through the window and Cooper asleep somewhere in the yard, David looked at the ceiling and thought about the fact that his life, which had been proceeding in a straight and predictable line for the better part of a decade, had in the space of 1 week become considerably more complex. He found, to his mild surprise, that he did not mind. The following Tuesday, he rode south to the farm beyond the river. He told himself he was going because Margaret had mentioned that she was having trouble with a section of fence along the east boundary, and he had fence wire he could spare, and it was a neighborly thing to do. This was true as far as it went, which was not quite all the way to the actual reason, but it was enough to get him to the gate. The farm was well kept, in the way of a place that is maintained by someone with more determination than resources. The house was a solid wooden structure with a porch that had been painted recently, and there were flowers in a window box that had been planted by someone with an eye for color. The big oak along the fence was exactly as David remembered it, enormous and ancient, and completely indifferent to everything happening beneath it. Margaret was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, and she looked up from what she was doing with an expression that was not surprised, which suggested either that she had been expecting him, or that she was simply not a woman who was surprised by much. "I brought fence wire," David said. "I can see that," Margaret said. "Come in and have coffee first." Lucy Holt turned out to be a 12-year-old with her mother's directness and her father's, according to Margaret, stubborn streak. She regarded David with the frank, evaluating stare of a child who has learned to take the measure of adults and finds most of them wanting. She asked him, over coffee at the kitchen table, how many cattle he had and whether he had ever been in a stampede, and whether the young woman at the dance was really his daughter even though he had clearly not known her for very long. David answered all of these questions honestly, and by the end of the coffee Lucy had apparently decided he was acceptable, because she went back outside without any further interrogation. "She does not warm to people easily," Margaret said. "She reminded me of Clara, actually," David said, "in the manner of asking questions." Margaret smiled. "That is the highest compliment you could give a 12-year-old. She will not know that, but I do." They mended the fence together through the afternoon, Margaret on one side and David on the other, which was not the conventional arrangement, but was the practical one given that she knew where the worst sections were. They talked while they worked, in the unhurried way of people who have discovered they are comfortable in each other's company. She asked about his childhood, and he told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a blacksmith and his mother who had been from Tennessee, and very particular about the correct way to do things, which had instilled in David a belief that most things had a correct way, even if you did not always know what it was. She told him about growing up in Indiana, about the family farm and 4 brothers, and the particular education of being the only girl in a household full of boys, which she said had made her practical and somewhat loud by necessity, though the loudness had quieted down over the years. By the time the fence was done, the sun was getting low, and David stayed for supper because Margaret offered, and he was not in any way inclined to refuse. They ate on the porch because the kitchen was warm, and Lucy ate her supper with the single-minded focus of someone who had spent the afternoon in vigorous physical activity, and afterward she fell asleep in the porch chair in the abrupt, total way that children fall asleep, there one moment and gone the next. Margaret and David sat in the fading light and did not talk for a while, which was its own kind of conversation, and when David finally rode home in the dark, he was aware that something had shifted in the careful, solitary arrangement of his days. Clara noticed, of course. Clara noticed most things. She noticed that he rode south on Tuesday and came home after dark, and did not explain where he had been. She noticed that he was quieter than usual that evening, but in a different way than his usual quiet, less closed and more occupied. The way a man is quiet when his mind is engaged with something interesting rather than merely empty. She noticed all of this and said nothing, and her silence had the quality of enormous, barely restrained satisfaction. On Thursday, she said, "I think I would like to call on Mrs. Holt." David looked up from the book he was attempting to read. "Oh, she seemed interesting," Clara said. And Lucy looked like someone who might benefit from the company of someone not quite so far past 12 as everyone else in her life. She paused. "I thought perhaps you might like to accompany me." "That is a considerable amount of logistical thinking for a spontaneous social call," David said. "I am organized," Clara said, with a composure that was entirely her own and entirely her mother's at the same time. "Will you come?" They rode to the Holt farm on Friday afternoon, and Lucy Holt greeted Clara with the same evaluating stare she had given David and then said, "Can you ride?" "Better than most people you have met," Clara said pleasantly. "Come on then," Lucy said, and the two of them were on horses and across the yard before Margaret had quite finished saying hello, which left David and Margaret standing on the porch watching their daughters disappear toward the south pasture. "She takes to people she likes immediately," Margaret said. "It just takes her a while to decide." "Clara is the same way," David said. They went inside and Margaret made lemonade with the careful economy of someone for whom sugar was not an extravagance to be wasted, and they sat at the kitchen table in the comfortable way they had already developed, which still surprised David somewhat, because he had not developed this kind of ease with anyone in a very long time. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Yes." "Do you regret leaving?" She said it simply, without accusation, the way a woman asks something when she genuinely wants to know the answer rather than to make a point with it. "Abilene, Belle." David considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the manner of it," he said. "The pride. The choosing to ride rather than to talk." He turned the glass in his hands. "I do not know that staying would have been right either. We were very young and we wanted different things from what we thought we wanted, if that makes sense." "It does. What I regret most," he said slowly, working it out as he said it, "is that she carried that alone for 11 years. Clara, the fact of Clara, that should not have been on one person's shoulders." He looked at Margaret directly. "That is the thing I cannot quite put down." Margaret nodded. She did not offer absolution, which he appreciated. Some things did not require forgiveness so much as they required being seen clearly. "And now that you have her," she asked. "Clara." Something moved across David's face that he could not have named and did not try to. "It is the strangest thing," he said. "I have known her for not quite 2 weeks, and I cannot imagine not knowing her. She is half her mother and half something entirely her own, and she rode 11 days across the Kansas plains to find a man she had never met because her dying mother asked her to." He shook his head. "That kind of courage makes a person reel very quickly." "Yes," Margaret said softly, "it does." They were quiet for a moment, in the kitchen with the afternoon light moving through the window and the sound of horses and 2 girls' voices coming faintly from the south pasture. "I would like to see more of you," David said. He said it directly, because Margaret was a person who responded to directness, and also because he had learned something in 11 years about the cost of not saying the thing. "If that is something you would consider." Margaret looked at him. He could see the caution in her, the careful assessment of a woman who had been managing alone for 2 years and had learned to be very sure before she added anything to the structure of her days that might compromise its balance. "I would consider it," she said. "I would like that." Outside, Lucy's voice rose in argument and Clara's voice answered, and then there was laughter, which was better than the alternative. The summer moved around them like a river finding its course. David rode to the Holt farm twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and Margaret and Lucy came to the Doyle ranch on Sundays when the weather was fair. Clara and Lucy formed the kind of friendship that seems inexplicable from the outside, given the 6-year age gap, but that makes complete internal sense because of the particular shared quality of having grown up as the steady centers of a household that needed a steady center. Tobias, the hired hand, developed a transparent crush on Clara that she handled with so much diplomatic kindness that David felt genuine admiration for her. The town of Caldwell observed all of this with the concentrated interest that small towns bring to bear on developments in their members' lives. And Mrs. Calloway, who organized the Grange dances and considered herself the social architect of the community, told several people that she had seen it coming from the moment David Doyle and Margaret Holt had sat on the bench outside the hall. In August, Earl Pickens returned a hand drill he had borrowed 2 winters ago, apparently as a gesture of goodwill, and David accepted it with less surprise at the return of the drill than at the possibility that Earl was capable of such gestures. Clara wrote letters to Mrs. Pendleton in Ellsworth and received letters in return, and she visited the small cemetery north of town where a handful of the town's earlier settlers lay, and she sat with whatever she was carrying about her mother in the quiet, private way she had learned to carry it. One evening, finding her sitting on the porch steps as the sun went down, David sat beside her and said simply, "Do you want to talk about her?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she was very determined. "About everything. About the garden and the cat and the correct way to iron a blouse and the incorrect way that most politicians handled most things." A pause. She was very funny when she chose to be, which she did not always choose to be because she thought it undermined her seriousness. Another pause longer. "She loved you, I know you know that from the photograph, but I think she loved you her whole life, even when she was angry, she just did not know what to do with it." David looked at the sunset. "I loved her too," he said. "I was not good at showing it at 23. I got better at a lot of things too late to be useful." He paused. "I am sorry for not being there." "She did not blame you," Clara said. "At the end, she specifically said not to tell you it was your fault. She said the fault was in the timing and in the both of you being too young and too stubborn." A small smile touched her face. "She said she had been stubborn enough for 3 people and that you had probably also been stubborn enough for 3, which made 6 people's worth of stubborn between you, which was too many." David made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "That sounds like her." "It does," Clara agreed. They sat together until the stars came out, his daughter and himself, and it was not quite comfortable and not quite easy yet, but it was real, which was better than comfortable in the ways that mattered. In September, the trouble with the garrison land came to a head. There was a man named Clyde Garrett who had come through Caldwell in July, claiming to have a deed to the original garrison acreage, which abutted David's eastern boundary, and which David had believed to be settled property. Garrett was not a violent man, exactly, but he was a man who believed that the surest path to what he wanted was to complicate the lives of the people who stood between him and it. He filed paperwork with the county land office claiming a prior deed and disputing David's eastern boundary line by nearly a quarter mile, which would have cut into the pasture David used for the bulk of his grazing. David went to the land office in Caldwell and spent an afternoon with the county records, which were better organized than he had expected, and which showed clearly that his deed had been properly registered, and that the claim Garrett was making was based on a document that, upon examination, turned out to have been improperly witnessed at the time of its original recording. The county land agent, a careful man named Mr. Simmons, said he would need to review everything thoroughly before making any determination. "How long will that take?" David asked. 2 weeks, perhaps 3, Simmons said. "Possibly longer if Garrett engages a lawyer." David rode home and told Clara about it because she had asked directly and because he found increasingly that she was a useful person to think through problems with. "Who recorded his deed?" Clara asked. "A man named Alden, apparently, who was the land agent in 1869. Alden is dead now." "And the witness?" "Someone named Cobb. I do not know if Cobb is still in the area." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I will go to the Historical Society," she said. "They may have records from that period." She paused. "Also, you should probably tell Mrs. Holt. She is south of the river, but if someone is disputing land deeds in this county, it affects her too. David thought about this and recognized, not for the first time, that Clara had inherited her mother's habit of seeing the practical implications of things before the situation required them to be seen. He rode to Margaret's that evening and told her about Garrett and the disputed deed. Margaret listened, and then she said, "I have the original deed for this property, and also Robert's survey notes from when he first purchased it. The county surveyors came through in 1876, and I kept a copy of their findings." She went to a box she kept in the bureau and produced, in good order, exactly the documents she had described. "Robert kept records of everything. I used to tease him about it." "Remind me to be grateful for your husband's organizational habits," David said. He would have been pleased to hear it. Margaret's expression was fond, and a little sad in the way it sometimes was when Robert came into the conversation. "Let me look at what you have. I am better with documents than most people assume." This turned out to be entirely accurate. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with David's copies and her own records, and over the course of 2 hours, identified 3 specific discrepancies in Garrett's claimed deed that pointed directly to the improper witnessing that Mr. Simmons had flagged. She laid them out clearly and wrote up a summary that was more organized and more cogent than anything David would have produced. "Where did you learn to do this?" David asked, watching her work. "My father was a county clerk," she said, without looking up from the documents. "I helped him with the records from the time I was 10. She made a notation in the margin. "People assume a woman on a farm spends all her time on domestic matters. This assumption is their problem, not mine." David looked at her bent over the documents by lamplight, with her partially escaped hair and her ink-stained fingers and her absolute concentration, and felt something shift and settle in him with the specific quality of something that had been looking for its right place for a very long time. He did not say anything about it that evening. He took the documents and thanked her and rode home in the dark. But he thought about it, the feeling and the lamplight and the specific quality of the settling. Clara, who was awake when he arrived and claimed she had been reading but had clearly been listening for the sound of his horse, looked at him across the kitchen and said, "You look like a man who has made up his mind about something." "Go to bed," David said. Clara went to bed smiling, which she clearly felt she had earned. Mr. Simmons ruled in David's favor 3 weeks later, after reviewing everything including Margaret's careful documentation of the inconsistencies. Garrett made one more attempt at the land office, which Simmons dismissed, and then apparently decided Caldwell was not worth the trouble and moved on, which David heard about second-hand from the barber. The autumn came in with the particular golden abruptness of a Kansas autumn, and the cottonwoods along the river turned the color of old coins, and the mornings developed an edge that reminded everyone that winter was building itself out on the plains and would arrive when it was ready. On an October afternoon that was cold enough for a coat, but warm enough in the sun to consider removing it, David rode to the Holt farm with a purpose he had been considering for most of September. Margaret was on the porch with mending in her lap, which she set aside when he came through the gate. Lucy was at school. It was a Tuesday, and the farm was quiet except for the wind in the cottonwood along the fence. David tied Roan to the fence post and walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps. He had thought about how to say this, and had decided that the direct approach was the only approach that made any sense, given who they both were. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with the understanding that I am hoping it leads somewhere permanent if you are willing. I am not interested in a casual arrangement, and I do not think you are either. I have a daughter who came to me out of nowhere 3 months ago and who has become as necessary to my life as anything I can think of, and I have 43 acres and 100 head of cattle and a dog named Cooper and a horse named Roan who does not trust strangers." He paused. "I trust you. I have trusted you since approximately the 2nd hour of our acquaintance, and I am aware that is unusual for me, but there it is." Another pause. "I think I am in love with you. I have been trying to be sure before saying it, but I am sure." Margaret looked at him from the porch. The afternoon light was on her face, and her eyes were very steady, and her mending was in a pile beside her chair. "I think I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying not to be because it is frightening, and because Lucy has already lost one man she depended on, and because it seemed impractical." She looked at him directly. "But I have not managed not to be." David climbed the porch steps and sat beside her in the other chair, and they were quiet for a moment in the October afternoon. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I made one decision in my life to ride away from something that mattered, and it cost me 11 years. I do not intend to repeat it." Margaret looked at him with that steady, careful regard of hers. "I believe you," she said. And then quietly, "That means something. That you can say that and I can believe it." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on the porch of the Holt farm in the October afternoon, while the cottonwood turned, and the wind moved across the Kansas plains in the old, indifferent, beautiful way it had been moving for longer than anyone in the territory could remember. Lucy came home from school at 4 o'clock and stopped at the gate when she saw David's horse. She walked up the porch steps and looked at the two of them sitting together with their hands interlinked, and she put her school bag down carefully and said, "Is this a permanent thing?" "I hope so," David said. Lucy looked at him with her mother's evaluating directness and whatever particular quality of her own that she brought to everything. "Clara told me you are a good man," she said. "She said she thinks you are the kind of man who stays." "She is right about that," David said. Lucy picked up her school bag. "All right," she said, and went inside. Margaret made a sound that was close to a laugh and very close to a breath of relief and said, "That is the Lucy version of approval." "I will take it," David said. The winter came in earnest in November, and the Doyle ranch and the Holt farm weathered it in the way neighboring places weather a Kansas winter when their inhabitants are in regular communication, which is to say with shared resources and mutual checking in, and the occasional shared meal when the cold made solitary cooking seem like unnecessary effort. Clara and Lucy had developed their friendship to the point where Lucy spent considerable time at the Doyle ranch working on her lessons at the kitchen table, while Clara helped Tobias with the afternoon feeding, which freed up Margaret for the considerable paperwork of running a farm through the winter months. In January, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow was thick on the ground and the roads were passable, but nobody was particularly comfortable on them, David drove the wagon to the Holt farm and they all four had supper together around Margaret's table. And afterward, Lucy went to sleep in the chair by the fire in the very same total way she always fell asleep. And Clara and David and Margaret sat with their coffee and the fire and the comfortable weight of the evening. "I would like to be married in the spring," David said. He looked at Margaret. "If you are willing." Margaret set down her coffee cup. She looked at him with that steady, clear regard. "The spring," she said. "April or May when the roads are good. We could have it at the church in Caldwell." "We would need to sell this farm," Margaret said. She said it without distress in the tone of someone working through practical considerations. "Or keep it and hire someone to run it. I would not want to sell it. Robert put considerable effort into it." "We could hire someone," David said. "The income from it would be useful, and Clara can help manage the books if she is willing." He glanced at Clara, who had been listening with a very studied expression of casualness. "I would be glad to," Clara said, abandoning the pretense entirely. "You could keep the farm in your name," David said to Margaret. "I have no interest in absorbing it. It is yours." Margaret looked at him. "Most men would want to consolidate." "I am not most men," David said with the mild firmness of someone who has thought about this and is sure of his position. "Your husband built that farm. Your daughter grew up on it. It should remain yours." The quiet between them had a different quality then, the kind of quiet that forms around something significant. "April," Margaret said. "I would like an April wedding." Clara's expression achieved something approaching radiance, which she then modulated because she was 17 going on 40 and did not show things too easily. "Good," David said. Outside, the snow fell on the Kansas plains in the patient, impartial way it had been falling on them since before any of them were born, and the fire in Margaret's hearth crackled against it. And Cooper, who had ridden in the wagon and come inside with a complete lack of permission, slept at the foot of the chair where Lucy was sleeping. There was a conversation David needed to have with Clara before the spring, and he had been putting it off with the particular combination of intention and avoidance that characterizes conversations that feel both necessary and difficult. He waited until February when the weather had turned slightly and they were in the stable doing the evening feeding, side by side in the amber warmth of the lantern. "There is something I want to tell you," he said, "and something I want to ask you." Clara set down the feed bucket and turned to look at him. She always gave him her full attention when something serious was being said. It was one of the things he had come to rely on. "Your mother's name," he said. "Ralston." It was your grandmother's family name on her mother's side. He had worked this out from the letters Clara had shown him from her mother's correspondence. "You kept it, Clara Ralston." "Yes," Clara said. "You do not have to change it," he said. "Not on my account. I would never ask you to. Ralston is your name, and it was your mother's name, and that is your history." He paused. "But I want you to know that if you ever wanted to take Doyle, or if you ever wanted to use both, I would not consider it anything other than an honor." He looked at her. "You are my daughter, Clara, and that is the truest thing I can say. Whatever name you carry, that does not change." Clara was very still for a moment. The horse in the next stall moved, and the lantern swung slightly, and somewhere outside the wind was saying something to the roof. "I would like to use both," she said. "Clara Ralston Doyle." "Then that is what it is," David said. Clara looked at him for another moment, and then she did something she had not done in the 4 months of their acquaintance, which was that she put her arms around him and pressed her forehead to his shoulder. And the particular specific grief of having a father she had never known, and having found him, and having a mother who was gone, and having come all this way alone was in the embrace, all of it at once. And David held his daughter in the stable in February, and felt the weight of 11 years of not knowing distribute itself across his shoulders like something he was finally large enough to carry. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright, and she straightened her coat in the brisk, practical way she had, and picked up the feed bucket. "We should finish the feeding before it is fully dark," she said. "Yes," David agreed, and picked up his own bucket. April arrived in Caldwell the way April always did in Kansas, with sudden green and uncertain weather and the smell of the earth turning over. The church filled with most of the town because Margaret Holt was well known and generally liked, and David Doyle was less well known but sufficiently respected, and the combination of two people that people approved of getting married was the kind of event that a town shows up for. Clara stood to David's left and Lucy stood to Margaret's right, and the two of them exchanged one look across the space between their parents that contained everything they had discussed on winter afternoons about what this meant, and what kind of family it would make and whether it was frightening. And then they both looked forward because the ceremony was beginning. The preacher was a round-faced man named Pastor Greaves, who had been in Caldwell for 6 years, and had the good sense to keep the ceremony sincere and reasonably brief. Margaret wore a dress of pale gray-blue that she had made herself, and she looked, David thought, like the most straightforwardly beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, which was not a complicated thought but was a complete and certain one. He said his vows in the direct, quiet way that he said everything that mattered. She said hers in the same voice, steady and clear and entirely true. The ring he put on her finger had been his mother's, brought from Missouri when he was 20 and kept in the bottom of his saddlebag for 11 years, and then, eventually, in a box in the bedroom of the ranch house, waiting without knowing it was waiting. Outside the church, in the April sunlight, Mrs. Calloway declared it the most moving ceremony she had witnessed in Caldwell in her 15 years of residence, and the barber agreed, and even Earl Pickens, who had come and stood at the back, said it had been a fine thing, which was as effusive as Earl was likely to get. There was a celebration at the Grange Hall in the evening, with Peters on the fiddle and the barber calling, and a table of food that the women of Caldwell had produced with the impressive collective efficiency of people who knew how to get a thing done. David danced with his wife, which was a word that arrived in his mind with the comfortable solidity of something that had always been true, and Clara danced with Tobias, and with the young man from the dance in July who had not stopped finding reasons to come around, and Lucy danced with 3 different partners, because once she had decided something was worth doing, she did it wholeheartedly. Late in the evening, David found himself standing at the edge of the dancing with a glass of cider in his hand, and Margaret beside him with her hand in the crook of his arm, watching their daughters in the lamplight. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. David considered the question. He thought about the morning 11 years ago when he had ridden south from Abilene, and the 11 years after that, and the July afternoon when a rider came up the road and looked exactly like her mother, and the dance where he had stood at the edge of things and gone to refill his punch cup and ended up with something he had not expected and did not know he needed. "Yes," he said, "I am." "Good," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder in the simple, total way of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the other side of it and found it solid underfoot. The household they built on the Doyle ranch was not a quiet one, which David had accepted and then, relatively quickly, come to prefer. Margaret's directness and Lucy's ongoing project of assessing the world, and Clara's particular combination of her mother's sharpness and something entirely her own, and Tobias, who was growing into his hands and his confidence, and who would eventually, David suspected, get up the nerve to say something to Clara about how he felt, and Cooper, who now slept in the kitchen instead of under the porch, because Margaret had decided a dog that age deserved to be warm. And the cattle and the fence and the 43 acres, and the Holt farm south of the river being managed by a capable couple, named the Andersons, who kept meticulous records in a way that would have satisfied Robert Holt entirely. The summer of 1883 was a good one for cattle prices, and David made improvements to the house, adding 2 rooms, one of which became Clara's proper bedroom, and one of which became a sitting room with actual furniture that Margaret selected with the same organizational care she brought to everything. The house became the kind of place that feels inhabited in all the right ways, where the furniture has been moved to where it actually makes sense, and the kitchen smells of things being cooked, and the porch has chairs suited to the people who sit in them. In October of 1883, Margaret told David, one morning over coffee, that she was expecting a child. David set down his coffee cup and looked at her. She was watching him with that careful, steady regard, waiting for his reaction with the particular attention of someone who has learned that reactions tell you important things. "When?" he managed. "April," she said. "Perhaps May." He got up from his chair and went around the table and put his arms around her and held on, and she laughed a little, the low, genuine laugh that he had first heard at the Grange Hall and had been wanting to hear for the rest of his life ever since. "Good," he said. "That is very good." Clara received this information with a composure that lasted approximately 10 seconds before she said, very clearly and with no ambiguity, "I am going to be the best older sister this child has ever had," which, given that she would be the only older sister, was technically certain, but was said with such fierce, warm determination that it made the sentiment plain. Lucy said, "I hope it is a boy. There are enough women in this family already." And then quickly, "I do not mean that in a bad way. I mean it in a numerically balanced way." The winter of 1883 to 1884 was a hard one, as winters in Kansas frequently were, and Margaret felt the cold more than she usually did and spent more time indoors than she was naturally inclined to. David made sure the firewood was always in, and the drafts were banked, and that there was always something warm on the stove, and Clara did the outdoor work that Margaret was disinclined to do without being asked, and without making a ceremony of it. In the evenings, They all four sat in the sitting room with the fire and the lamps and the particular domestic containment of a Kansas winter. And Margaret worked on the small clothes she was making with the same careful precision she brought to everything. And David read, or attempted to read, and Lucy worked on her lessons. And Clara wrote letters or mended or occasionally played the small organ that had been in Margaret's house and had been moved to the ranch house in the consolidation. David watched all of this with the quiet attention of a man who has discovered, late but completely, that the life he had built by accumulation and stubbornness, and the occasional piece of luck was not merely sufficient, but abundant in the ways that could not be measured by acreage or cattle count. On a May morning in 1884, in the bedroom of the Doyle ranch house with Clara and Lucy in the kitchen and Dr. Flint from Caldwell in attendance, and David in the hallway with his hat in his hands, Margaret delivered their son. He was a healthy, loud, determined person from his first moments, which seemed entirely fitting. David held his son in the lamplight of the bedroom while Margaret rested, and the boy looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient regard of the newborn. And David thought about standing at a fence line in July 1882 with a hammer in his hand and the dust of the road settling, and the particular way a life can arrange itself around you when you have stopped trying to run ahead of it. They named him James Robert Doyle. James for David's father, who had been a blacksmith in Missouri and a good man. Robert for Margaret's late husband, who had built the farm south of the river and kept meticulous records and deserved to be remembered in the naming of things. Clara held her half-brother in the kitchen that afternoon with a competence and tenderness that suggested she had been practicing in some part of herself for exactly this. Lucy held him next and then held him back to Clara with the air of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. "He is very red," she said, "but I think he will improve with time." "All babies are red at the start," Clara said. "You were too." "I was not," Lucy said. "You were," Margaret said, from the doorway where she had appeared wrapped in a quilt, against David's objections, because she said she was perfectly well and wanted to see her children in the kitchen. "You were the reddest baby in Indiana County, according to your grandmother." Lucy considered this information and then apparently decided to accept it because she said, "All right, he will be fine then." James Robert Doyle became, over the course of his first year of life, the subject of a considerable amount of attention from all four of the people who had arranged themselves around him. Clara read to him, and Lucy made up elaborate and mostly improbable stories to tell him, and David spent hours simply sitting with him in the porch chair in the evenings, showing him the yard and the pasture and the sky, and telling him the names of things. Tobias, who had finally, in the autumn of 1884, gathered himself together sufficiently to tell Clara how he felt about her, was met with a response that was neither a simple yes nor a simple no, but was a carefully considered and honest accounting of what she thought they might be to each other and what she needed time to determine. This was so entirely like Clara that Tobias, who had expected something much simpler in either direction, spent 2 days being confused about it, and then decided that a woman who thought this carefully about things was worth whatever patience it required. Clara Ralston Doyle, at 19, had a life that was still being made, and she was making it with the same purposeful competence she brought to everything, which was to say on her own terms and in her own time and with full awareness of the territory. The Holt farm south of the river continued to prosper under the Anderson couple, and Margaret checked on it monthly and kept the books herself, and the income from it provided for the ranch in ways that allowed David to pay Tobias properly and to save toward the additional acreage he had been considering along the northern boundary. In the spring of 1885, he purchased 12 additional acres from a family named Kowalski who were moving further west, and the Doyle Ranch became 55 acres of good Kansas land with water rights on the eastern edge, and a view from the ridge that in the evening light was something that people who had traveled considerably further for scenery would have stopped to see. Clara rode with him to survey the new boundary on a March afternoon, the two of them on horseback with the Kansas wind in their faces and the grass just beginning its return to green, and she said, "Mother would have liked this." "I know," David said. "She always said you had a sense for land," Clara said. "She said it was the first thing she noticed about you, that you looked at the ground the way other men look at the sky." David turned this over. "I did not know she thought that." "There is a great deal she thought that she did not say," Clara said, not with sadness exactly, with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who loved a person well enough to see them truly. She was better at the feeling than at the saying of it. She looked at him. "You are better at the saying of it than I expected, given what she told me." "I learned," David said. "The long way," Clara nodded. "That seems to be the way most things worth knowing get learned." They rode back to the ranch house, where the smoke was already rising from the kitchen chimney, and the sound of Lucy arguing with James Robert, who was not yet a year old and therefore could not argue back, but was apparently providing sufficient opposition by means of volume, came through the window on the spring air. The life they lived inside that house was a real one, with all that real means, which is to say it had difficulty and disagreement and illness and cold mornings, and the particular frustrations of too many people in not quite enough space and fences that broke down at inconvenient times, and cattle that wandered and equipment that failed. It also had the fire in the evening, and the coffee in the morning, and the laughter at the supper table, and the children growing, and the particular, irreplaceable quality of waking each day beside someone whose presence makes the day worth the trouble of beginning it. David had learned by now that he was not a man who expressed himself easily in words alone. He expressed himself in the mended fence, and the firewood stacked correctly, and the way he always made sure Margaret's coffee was ready before he addressed anything else in the morning, and in the deliberate, daily choosing of everything that mattered. Margaret, who had learned to read the language of actions in the same way she had learned to read the language of county records, read him clearly, and returned the expression in kind. On a July evening in 1885, exactly 3 years after Clara had ridden up the road and looked exactly like her mother, David sat on the porch in the late light with Margaret beside him and James Robert asleep in the basket between their chairs. Clara was in the barn checking on a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg. Lucy was inside at the table working on something for school with the ferocious concentration she brought to things she wanted to do well. The Kansas evening spread itself across the horizon in that extravagant way it had, the colors that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, as if the sky is making a statement about the nature of beauty and its relationship to the specific geography of the Great Plains. 3 years ago today, David said. Margaret looked at him. Since she rode up the road. He nodded toward the barn where Clara's lamp was visible through the open door. I was mending the fence and I looked up and she was coming through the gate. Margaret was quiet for a moment. And what did you think? In the first moment, I thought I was seeing her mother, David said. And then I thought I was going to fall over. He paused. And then she told me her name, and I thought that 11 years is a very long time to be wrong about something and still not know how wrong you were. Are you glad she came? David looked at the barn and the light in it, and at Margaret beside him, and at the sleeping weight of their son in the basket, and at the house behind them full of the ordinary, extraordinary business of the life they had built. I am glad she came, he said. I am glad she rode 11 days across the Kansas plains to find a man she had never met, because she loved her mother enough to honor a promise, and because she was brave enough to make the journey, and because if she had not, I would not have gone to that dance and I would not have stood at the punch bowl at precisely the right moment. He turned to look at Margaret. She changed everything. She did, Margaret agreed, with a soft warmth in her voice. The day she rode up, David said, I was 43 acres and 100 cattle and a quiet life that I had told myself was sufficient. He shook his head slightly. I had no idea. No one ever does, Margaret said. That is rather the point of it. Inside, Lucy called something to Clara, who had apparently come in from the barn, and Clara's voice answered, and James Roberts stirred in his basket and then settled again, and the July evening continued in its impossible colors across the western sky. David reached over and took his wife's hand in the way he had been taking it for the past year and more, with the ease of something that has become entirely natural, and she turned her hand to meet his, and they sat in the warm Kansas evening and watched the colors come down from the sky. Clara appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame, looking at the two of them on the porch with the expression she had developed that was different from her mother's knowing look but occupied the same territory. "The horse is fine," she said, "just a bruise on the hoof wall." "Good," David said. Clara looked at the evening sky. "It is beautiful tonight." "It is always beautiful," Margaret said. "You just do not always have the time to notice." Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the voice she used for things she had been thinking about for a while, "I wrote to Tobias today. I told him that I think, if he is patient, we might work out to something good." She did not look at either of them when she said it. She was looking at the sky with a particular self-contained expression. David and Margaret exchanged a look that contained everything that needed to be said and said none of it. "He is a good man," David said. "He is finding his way." "I know," Clara said. "That is why I thought it was worth saying." She pushed off the doorframe. "I am going to put together something for supper. Lucy claims she is starving." "Lucy always claims she is starving," Margaret said. "She usually is," Clara said and went inside. The summer evening settled into the blue of early dark, and James Robert woke and was not happy about it, and David took him from the basket and walked the porch with him in the old way, the rocking walk that babies have recognized as comfort since, before anyone was keeping records of such things. The boy looked up at him with his mother's steady dark eyes and his own whatever it was that was his and no one else's. David told him the names of things: the barn, the fence, the cottonwood at the corner of the yard, the star that was the first one visible as the dark deepened, the sound of the wind coming down from the north, the particular smell of a Kansas evening in July, which is dry grass and water somewhere distant, and the warmth still rising off the ground even as the air above begins to cool. The boy listened in his baby way, with that ancient, unfocused attention. "You have good people around you," David told him quietly. "A mother who sees everything and a sister who will protect you with everything she has, and another sister who will argue you into being better than you planned. And a father who did not know, for the first year of your life, that the best thing that ever found its way to him was a rider coming up the road in the summer of 1882. He looked at his son. "I know you are too young for any of this, but I wanted you to know it was said." Margaret appeared at the door and watched the two of them in the dark of the porch, and her expression in the lamplight from inside was the expression of a woman who has built something real and knows it and does not take it lightly. "Come inside," she said. "Clara has supper ready." David brought their son inside, into the warm and the light and the particular beautiful noise of all of them gathered in one place, and the door closed behind him on the Kansas night. The years that came after were, for the most part, the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but that constitute the substance of a life. The ranch grew incrementally. The Holt farm continued to produce well. Lucy finished her schooling in Caldwell, and then, to David's considerable pride and her mother's equal pride and Lucy's own matter-of-fact acceptance of her own abilities, enrolled in a teacher's college in Topeka, which was a remarkable thing for 1887, and which Lucy approached as if remarkable things were simply the natural consequence of deciding to do them. Clara Ralston, Doyle, and Tobias were married in the autumn of 1886, in the same church in Caldwell where David and Margaret had married, and it was a smaller ceremony but no less genuine, and Belle Ralston's name was spoken in it, briefly and with love, by Clara in her vows, because she saw no reason to leave out the person who had made her who she was. In the spring of 1888, Clara and Tobias had a son, which made David a grandfather at 40, a fact he contemplated with some bemusement and a great deal of warmth. The boy was named William, and he had Clara's eyes and Tobias's ears and the general disposition of a person who had arrived with opinions already formed. James Robert Doyle grew into a boy who was, as Lucy had predicted, improved considerably from his original red and vocal state. He had his mother's manner of seeing through to the center of things, and his father's way of being quiet when something serious was happening. He loved horses with a specificity and devotion that suggested he had been born to the territory, and he could ride by the time he was 5 with a confidence that made Tobias, who had grown into an excellent horseman himself, say that the boy was a natural. On a Sunday in the summer of 1889, 7 years after the July afternoon when Clara had come up the road, the whole family gathered on the porch of the Doyle ranch house in the way they now gathered on summer Sundays. Margaret and David in their chairs, Clara and Tobias with young William between them on the bench, Lucy home from Topeka for the summer sitting on the step, James Robert sprawled in the yard with Cooper II, who was the son of Cooper, and equally opinionated about his sleeping arrangements. Earl Pickens came past on the road and called over the fence that it was a fine day, which it was, and David agreed that it was, and Earl went on, and the afternoon continued in the way that good Sunday afternoons continue, which is slowly and without obligation. "Tell me again," James Roberts said from his position in the yard. He was 6 now, and he had heard this story several times and showed no signs of being finished with it. "Tell you what," David said. "About when Clara came to the gate," James Roberts said. "About how you did not know." Clara made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "You have heard it 4 times, she said. "I want to hear it again," James Roberts said, with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old who knows what he wants. David looked at his son in the afternoon light, and at his wife beside him, and at Clara with her husband and her small boy, and at Lucy on the step with her book, and at the ranch that had become a home in the fullest sense of the word, and at the Kansas sky above all of it, which was doing what the Kansas sky always did in summer, which was to be so blue and so vast that it made everything beneath it feel both very small and exactly the right size. "Your sister rode 11 days across the Kansas plains," David said. "She came up the road in July in the dust and the heat, and she turned her horse through the gate, and I looked up from the fence I was mending. And," James Robert prompted, "and she looked exactly like her mother," David said, "and I did not know, and then I did, and everything changed." James Robert considered this with the solemn attention of someone receiving important information. "And then you married Mama," he said. "Eventually," David said, "and then you had me." "Yes. And now we all live here," James Roberts said, summarizing the situation with a completeness that 6-year-olds sometimes manage better than anyone. "Yes," David said, "now we all live here." Margaret reached over and took his hand, and Clara was laughing at something William had said, and Lucy had given up on her book and was watching the road the way people watch roads when they are used to things arriving on them, and Cooper II was sleeping in the yard in the particular boneless way that dogs sleep when they have decided everything is as it should be. The afternoon light moved across the yard and the pasture and the distant fields, and the road that led north to Caldwell and south to the river, and on from there in every direction that roads led, carrying everything they carried, and coming back eventually to the gate where, on a July afternoon 7 years ago, a young woman on a chestnut mare had turned in from the road and changed everything. David Doyle held his wife's hand in the summer afternoon and thought that a man could spend 11 years inside the quiet shape of his regrets, and then a rider could come up the road with his lost love's eyes and his lost love's bearing, and the world could rearrange itself entirely, and the rearrangement could turn out to be the truest thing that had ever happened to him. He thought about Belle, who had kept a photograph in her Bible for 11 years, and had made her daughter promise to find a man she had never met, and had raised that daughter to be brave enough to do it. He thought about the particular, stubborn, fierce, humorous love that Belle Ralston had carried for most of her life and had expressed in the way she knew best, which was indirectly and privately, and in the end, through the daughter she had sent to put right what time and pride and stubbornness had taken apart. "Thank you," he said quietly, not to anyone in the yard, but to the afternoon, to the sky, to whatever reached that far. Margaret looked at him. She did not ask who he was thanking. She knew. She had always known, because she was that kind of woman, and she thought it was exactly right, and she held his hand in the Kansas summer afternoon and let the gratitude be what it was. James Robert fell asleep in the yard at some point, as he often did on summer afternoons, as completely and totally as his half-sister Lucy had always fallen asleep in chairs, and Tobias carried him inside, and the porch slowly emptied as the evening came on, and the last of the day's light lay gold across the fence line, and the pasture and the road, gilding everything it touched with the particular insistence of a summer sun that is not quite ready to be done. David sat alone on the porch for a few minutes after everyone had gone in the brief companionable solitude of a man at the end of a good day, and he listened to his family inside the house, the voices and the movement and the particular beloved music of it, and he looked at the road one more time. Empty now, peaceful, just the road going its ways, bringing whatever it was going to bring, which had turned out in the summer of 1882 to be the most important thing it had ever carried. He got up from his chair and went inside, into the light and the warmth and the people he loved, and the door closed behind him, and the Kansas evening settled across the ranch in the old, beautiful, indifferent way, and the stars came out one by one, and everything was as it should be.